At the end of most days, there is rarely a clear moment where everything feels complete, where the last task is checked off, the last thought is resolved, and the day officially announces that it is finished. More often, the day simply stops where it is, not because everything has been done, but because time has moved on, leaving things open in small, ordinary ways that are easy to recognize. Work slows down without fully wrapping itself up. Messages remain unanswered. Notes stay half-read. Tabs are left open, and plans remain loosely outlined, not because they were forgotten, but because there was no natural place to end them before the evening arrived. This unfinished quality tends to carry forward into the night. Lights are turned off in rooms that still look the same as they did earlier. Devices are set aside without ceremony, and the body becomes still while the sense of not quite done lingers quietly in the background. Nothing specific feels urgent in these moments. There is no problem demanding attention, no decision that needs to be made right now, yet the expectation that something should have been finished can remain, as if the day should have closed more neatly than it did. Many things are left unfinished simply because it became late. Not because they reached a stopping point, but because the night arrived and interrupted effort in the same unremarkable way it always does. Without asking whether everything was complete, thoughts often stop the same way. Ideas trail off mid-sentence, conversations replay without resolution, and plans remain partially formed, not because they are important, but because they were never meant to be finished tonight. Lying down while this sense of incompletion remains can feel slightly out of place, as though rest should wait until everything has been sorted out. But the night does not wait for things to be wrapped up, and it never has. Most days end in the middle of something. Sentences are not finished. Lists are left incomplete. Understanding remains partial, and nothing breaks because of this. Tomorrow exists, but it does not require attention right now. What was left unfinished does not lose its place, and what remains open does not become more urgent simply because the day has ended. The expectation that everything should be finished before the night begins is something learned over time, not something the night itself enforces. The night arrives, whether things are complete or not, and it carries unfinished days forward without comment. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for time to continue. The day has already moved on. The moment has already changed, and what remains incomplete is allowed to remain exactly where it is. As the night settles into its usual rhythm, effort often lingers longer than intention, not because it is needed, but because it has not yet realized that its role for the day has quietly ended. There can be a faint sense of momentum without direction, as though something was in motion earlier and has now slowed, yet never received a clear signal to stop. Much of daily effort ends this way, not with completion, but with interruption. Activities lose their urgency, attention drifts away, and what was being worked on remains exactly where it was last touched, suspended not by decision, but by the simple passage of time. This happens so often that it becomes invisible. Most things are not finished. They are abandoned temporarily, left to rest where they are until another moment arrives, if it ever does. And yet, despite how common this is, there remains an expectation that effort should conclude cleanly, that the day should fold itself into something orderly before it is allowed to pass. The night does not participate in this expectation. It does not wait for momentum to taper off gracefully. It does not pause for loose ends. It arrives regardless, cutting across effort in the same neutral way it always has. There are evenings when it becomes clear that nothing has actually been brought to a stopping point, and yet everything necessary has already stopped. The contrast between these two conditions, unfinished and inactive, can feel unfamiliar, even though it is one of the most common states people inhabit. Effort is used to being directed toward outcomes. It expects to reach something definite, to arrive somewhere that signals it can stand down. When that signal does not appear, effort can remain nearby, hovering, uncertain whether it is still required. This hovering does not indicate failure. It simply reflects how effort behaves when the structure that usually guides it has dissolved for the night, leaving behind activity without purpose. The interruption of completion is not a mistake in this context. It is the night's natural function, arriving not to resolve, but to interrupt, to draw a line through the day without consulting its contents. Many unfinished things survive this interruption without consequence. They remain intact, unchanged by the pause, neither improved nor damaged by the lack of closure, waiting without urgency for another moment that may or may not arrive. What often lingers is not the work itself, but the sense that something was supposed to reach an endpoint. This sense can follow into stillness, creating a low-level tension that does not attach to any specific task, but to the idea of incompletion itself. Yet incompletion is not an error state. It is the default condition of most human effort, which moves forward in fragments, revisited and revised over time, rarely concluding all at once. The night treats these fragments with indifference. It does not distinguish between what is finished and what is paused. It does not preserve effort more carefully if it was nearly complete. It simply carries everything forward into a quieter context. At this point, effort can feel slightly out of place. With no immediate outlet, it may turn inward, replaying what was left open, not to resolve it, but to remain active in the absence of direction. This inward movement can give the impression that something still needs to be done, even when nothing practical remains available. The body has stopped, the environment has stopped changing, only the habit of effort continues. Over time, this habit softens on its own, not because it is persuaded, but because it is no longer reinforced by conditions that require action. The night does not provide feedback to effort. It does not reward continued engagement. It does not respond to checking. In the absence of response, effort gradually loses interest. Unfinished work, unfinished thoughts, unfinished plans remain where they are, not demanding attention, not exerting pressure, simply existing as they were when activity ceased. They are not waiting in the way urgency waits. They are waiting in the way objects remain on a table when the room goes dark. This kind of waiting does not require supervision. Nothing about it changes simply because it is being noticed, and nothing improves by being revisited at this hour. The interruption of completion becomes more apparent here. There is no final accounting, no summary, no sense of having reached the end of a sequence, and still, time continues. Effort begins to recognize, gradually, that continuation does not depend on it reaching an endpoint. Things move forward even when they are left open. Tomorrow arrives whether or not today was properly finished. This realization does not arrive as a thought. It emerges as a shift in how effort relates to the moment, loosening its grip as the conditions that supported it fade. What remains is not inactivity, but a quieter form of presence, where effort no longer needs to justify itself through completion. It can remain unfinished without being unresolved. The night supports this state by offering no alternative. There is nowhere else for effort to go, and nothing left for it to accomplish, leaving it to rest not because it was told to, but because it has nothing left to respond to. Unfinished effort becomes simply effort that has stopped. Not stored, not evaluated, not corrected. And in this way, the interruption of completion reveals something ordinary and durable, that most things do not need to be finished in order to be set aside, and that time does not require closure to keep moving forward. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for the night to continue doing what it has always done. Effort pauses where it is. Unfinished things remain intact, and time carries everything forward without asking for conclusions. As the night moves deeper, it becomes clearer that many endings in life are not chosen, but absorbed quietly by the passing of time, which steps in where decisions no longer matter. There is no announcement when this happens, no moment that asks for agreement, only a gradual shift where effort loses its relevance and continuation takes over. During the day, stopping usually feels like an action. Things are paused deliberately, tasks are closed intentionally, and attention is guided toward the next step. At night, this structure dissolves, and stopping happens without being planned, as though time itself has decided that enough has already occurred. This change can feel unfamiliar, especially when effort is accustomed to being involved in every transition. Without a clear point of conclusion, attention may remain active, waiting for a signal that no longer arrives, uncertain whether it is allowed to disengage without completing something first. But the night does not offer signals in the way the day does. It replaces instruction with quiet persistence, moving forward without asking whether anything has been accounted for or resolved. In this context, unfinished effort is no longer something that belongs to the present moment. It becomes part of what has already passed, even if it was never formally concluded, carried into the background by the simple fact that time has continued. This can feel strange at first, as though something important has been skipped. Yet this skipping is how most transitions actually occur, not only at night, but whenever circumstances change faster than effort can adapt. The difference at night is that there is no alternative direction to redirect effort toward. The usual structures that absorb attention, tasks, conversations, choices, are no longer available, leaving time itself as the only thing still moving. In this space, effort no longer needs to decide where to go next. There is no next step to prepare for, no outcome to aim toward, no endpoint that must be reached before continuation is allowed. Time takes on the role that decision normally plays. It carries experience forward without negotiation, reducing the need for effort to remain involved in the process of stopping. What was left unfinished earlier does not resist this movement. It remains where it was, unchanged, neither improved nor worsened by the lack of closure, as the night moves on without referring back to it. The sense that something should still be addressed often fades here, not because it was answered, but because it was no longer reinforced. Without new input, effort loses momentum, and the habit of pushing toward completion weakens. This is not a moment of resolution. Nothing is clarified, nothing is summarized, nothing is concluded, and yet continuation is uninterrupted. The night establishes a boundary that does not require agreement. It marks an ending without defining what ended, allowing experience to shift context without needing to finish what came before. In this way, stopping becomes passive rather than active. Effort does not step away deliberately. It is simply left behind as time moves forward without it. This is often when attention begins to feel less responsible for what remains unfinished. Without a role to play, it no longer needs to hold everything in view, allowing incomplete things to exist without supervision. What remains is a quieter form of presence, where effort has been replaced by passage. Time continues, experience continues, unfinished things stay where they are. The night does not correct or complete what was left open. It simply moves on, carrying everything with it, whether it was finished or not. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for this movement to continue. The boundary has already been crossed. The day has already given way, and what remains unfinished no longer belongs to this moment. Over time, stopping in the middle of things becomes less noticeable, not because circumstances improve, but because attention grows accustomed to the fact that most movement in life does not end cleanly. Effort slows, pauses, and resumes across many days without ever forming a complete arc, and experience carries on regardless, treating interruption as ordinary rather than exceptional. This pattern is visible everywhere once it is noticed. Projects extend beyond their original shape, conversations fade without conclusions, intentions change quietly, and plans remain loosely formed, not because something went wrong, but because time continued before they could settle into final form. At night, this becomes especially clear. There is no expectation that effort should wrap itself up neatly before giving way to stillness, and no mechanism that enforces completion once activity has lost its place. Stopping mid-motion does not require justification here. There is no audience waiting for results, no structure insisting that something be brought to an end before it can be left behind. What remains unfinished simply remains. It does not call attention to itself. It does not demand correction. It exists quietly, much like everything else that has been set aside by the passing of time. As this becomes familiar, the sense of urgency that once accompanied incompletion begins to lose its force. Effort no longer feels obligated to account for everything it touched earlier, and attention does not need to keep track of what has been left open. The night reinforces this by offering no opportunity for revision. Once activity has ended, there is nothing available to continue, no place for effort to re-enter, leaving unfinished things suspended without pressure. This suspension is not fragile. Unfinished moments do not collapse without attention. They remain stable in their incompleteness, unaffected by the lack of resolution. Over time, this changes how stopping is experienced. Instead of feeling like an interruption, it begins to feel like a natural pause, one that does not need explanation or defense. The idea that something must be finished before it can be set aside loses its authority here. Completion becomes one possible outcome among many, rather than a requirement imposed on every effort. In this state, unfinished effort no longer feels like unfinished business. It feels like effort that has simply reached the edge of the day, where time takes over an activity is no longer relevant. Nothing about this requires acceptance or understanding. It happens whether it is noticed or not, shaped by the same quiet passage that ends every day without consulting what occurred within it. As the night continues, this unremarkable stopping becomes easier to live inside. Attention rests not because everything is complete, but because nothing is being continued. Unfinished things remain untouched. Not ignored, not dismissed, simply no longer active. This is how most days actually end. Not with completion, but with quiet interruption, where effort fades before reaching an end point, and time carries on without asking it to conclude. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for this to feel ordinary. Stopping mid-motion is already part of how the night arrives, and continuation does not depend on closure. As the night moves further along, unfinished things often begin to feel less present, not because they have been completed or set aside deliberately, but because their connection to the moment has weakened on its own. What once carried weight earlier in the day starts to feel distant, as though it belongs to a different context that no longer applies. This distance does not arrive all at once. It appears gradually, as attention stops revisiting the same points, and as the conditions that gave unfinished things their importance quietly fall away. During the day, relevance is maintained by momentum. Effort stays connected to what is happening because there are immediate reasons for it to do so. But when those reasons disappear, relevance fades without needing to be actively removed. At night, unfinished things are no longer reinforced. They are not revisited, not developed further, and not placed back into motion, leaving them without the context that once made them feel necessary. This does not mean they are resolved. They simply become inactive, suspended in a way that does not require attention, waiting without urgency or pressure. Over time, attention adapts to this inactivity. Without new input, unfinished things stop pulling focus, not because they have been answered, but because they are no longer supported by the present moment. The night offers no reminders. There are no cues to return to what was left open, no signals that encourage further engagement, allowing unfinished things to exist without being brought forward. This absence of reinforcement is often enough. Without resistance or effort, relevance dissolves naturally, and what once felt pressing becomes simply part of what has already passed. In this way, incompletion does not accumulate. Unfinished things do not pile up in the mind when they are no longer active. They remain where they were last held, neither growing heavier nor demanding resolution. As attention stays with the present, the sense that something should be addressed weakens. Not because it was corrected, but because there is no longer anything in the environment asking for it. The night supports this shift by remaining unchanged. Time moves forward without reference to what was left behind, and experience continues without returning to earlier points. What remains unfinished loses its ability to interrupt. It no longer competes with the moment, no longer asserts its importance, and no longer needs to be accounted for. This is not forgetfulness. It is the natural effect of disconnection, where relevance fades as the situation that created it ends. As this continues, the idea that unfinished things require attention becomes less convincing. Without relevance, they lose their hold, becoming quieter without being resolved. Nothing about this process needs to be managed. It unfolds on its own, guided by the same quiet passage that moves the night forward without asking for completion. Unfinished things remain unfinished, but no longer active. They exist without pressure, without urgency, and without influence over the present moment. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for this shift to occur. Relevance fades, time continues, and experience moves on without requiring anything to be brought to a close. As the night settles into a deeper quiet, attention often begins to loosen in ways that are not deliberate and not noticed at first, simply because the conditions that once required its involvement are no longer present. There is no clear moment where attention decides to step back. It fades gradually, like background noise becoming less distinct when there is nothing new to respond to. During the day, attention is shaped by necessity. It moves where it is needed, follows cues, responds to changes, and stays active because something in the environment continues to call for it. When those calls stop, attention does not immediately recognize that it can disengage. It remains nearby for a while, out of habit rather than purpose. This habit is gentle, not insistent. Attention lingers because it has been involved for so long, not because it is worried about what remains unfinished. It stays present in the same way one might remain standing after a conversation has ended, simply because no signal was given to sit down. Over time, the absence of reinforcement becomes noticeable. Nothing responds when attention checks in. Nothing changes when it revisits the same thought. Nothing advances when it tries to continue what was left open. In this quiet lack of response, effort slowly loses relevance. Without feedback, attention no longer knows where to go, and without direction, it begins to rest where it is, not because it was instructed to, but because there is nowhere else for it to move. This resting does not feel like stopping. It feels like drifting, where focus softens and boundaries blur, and the need to stay engaged weakens without being replaced by anything else. Thoughts may still appear, but they do so without support. They arise briefly, repeat familiar outlines, and then lose coherence as there is nothing encouraging them to continue, no context asking them to develop further. The same happens with unfinished effort. Without a situation to return to, it remains suspended, neither progressing nor demanding completion, simply existing as something that once mattered but no longer has a place in the present moment. Attention adjusts to this suspension gradually. It stops expecting unfinished things to respond, and without expectation, it stops returning to them as often. This is how letting go usually happens. Not through decision or resolve, but through the steady realization that nothing is being reinforced, that continuing to engage produces no change. The night supports this process by remaining consistent. The environment stays the same. Time continues without interruption. There are no new cues to reawaken effort. In this consistency, attention begins to trust that nothing requires its oversight. It does not need to monitor what is happening, because what is happening is not asking for anything. Unfinished things remain present in a distant way, but they no longer feel connected to action. They are detached from urgency, no longer framed as tasks or problems, but as remnants of earlier activity that have been left behind by time. This detachment does not erase them. It simply removes the need to interact with them, allowing them to exist without influence over the current moment. As attention rests in this state, the effort to finish, to conclude, to bring things to a close begins to feel unnecessary. Not because finishing has been rejected, but because it no longer serves a function here. The night does not require attention to keep things intact. It carries unfinished effort forward without assistance, proving quietly that continuation does not depend on completion. In this way, attention lets go without ever being told to do so. It loosens its grip because there is nothing left to hold, and nothing waiting on the other side of completion. Unfinished things remain unfinished. Effort remains paused. Time continues. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for attention to rest. The absence of reinforcement is enough, and the night moves forward without requiring anything to be brought to an end. As the night moves further along, the idea of tomorrow often begins to lose its sharpness, not disappearing, but becoming less specific, less demanding, and less able to shape what is happening now. It remains present in a vague way, like something known to exist without needing to be approached or prepared for in this moment. During the day, tomorrow tends to feel close. It influences decisions, shapes priorities, and gives unfinished things their sense of urgency, as though what comes next is already leaning into the present. At night, that closeness fades, and tomorrow moves slightly out of reach, no longer positioned to guide attention or effort. This shift does not come from deliberate dismissal. Tomorrow is not rejected or ignored. It simply loses relevance as the conditions that usually bring it forward fall away. Without schedules to respond to or outcomes to anticipate, the future becomes less detailed. Plans lose their structure. Expectations soften. What once felt clearly outlined becomes indistinct, more like a general direction than a set of steps. In this state, unfinished things no longer feel tightly connected to what comes next. They exist without pulling attention forward, no longer framed as preparation for the future, but as remnants of a day that has already passed. The mind often notices this change indirectly. Thoughts about what follows become shorter, less elaborate, and less convincing, drifting in without forming complete scenarios before dissolving again. This is not forgetfulness. It is the result of the future no longer being reinforced by the present, leaving it without the weight it carried earlier. The night supports this distancing by offering nothing that requires planning. There are no immediate choices to be made, no steps to organize, and no consequences that hinge on preparation at this hour. As a result, attention no longer leans forward. It remains closer to what is happening now, even if what is happening now is quiet, undefined, and unremarkable. The idea of finishing things for tomorrow begins to feel unnecessary here. Without a clear image of what tomorrow demands, completion loses its purpose, and unfinished things no longer feel like obstacles to what comes next. Time continues through this state without marking progress. There is no countdown, no sense of approaching a threshold, only the steady passage of hours that do not point ahead. The body often follows this shift without notice. Energy settles, movement slows further. There is no sense of gearing up for what follows. In this softened view of the future, unfinished things become less personal. They no longer feel like responsibilities waiting to be carried forward, but like parts of another context that will return when the conditions that support them return as well. This separation allows attention to remain where it is without strain. There is no need to prepare, no need to anticipate, no need to bring anything to a close in advance. The night holds this distance quietly. Tomorrow exists, but it does not intrude. The future remains, but it does not insist. In this space, experience becomes easier to inhabit. Not because it has improved, but because it is no longer being shaped by what has not yet arrived. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for tomorrow to exist. The future does not require preparation at this hour, and time moves forward without asking anything to be resolved in advance. As the night continues, the present remains sufficient on its own. Unfinished things stay where they are. Tomorrow stays where it belongs, and experience continues, unhurried and intact. As the night carries on, there is often a gradual softening in the sense of who one is required to be, where roles that felt solid earlier in the day begin to loosen without being consciously set aside. Titles, responsibilities, and positions do not disappear, but they lose their immediacy, as though they belong to a different part of time that is no longer active. During the day, identity is reinforced through action. Attention moves in ways that reflect what is expected. Effort aligns itself with roles, and experience is shaped by what must be maintained. At night, these reinforcements fall away, and without them, identity becomes less defined, less directive, and less involved. This change does not feel like a loss. It feels like a release from constant reference, where awareness no longer needs to measure itself against expectations or outcomes. In this state, experience is no longer filtered through what one is supposed to be doing. Moments are not evaluated in terms of productivity or alignment. They are simply present, without being compared to a role that needs to be fulfilled. Unfinished things feel different here as well. They are no longer tied to identity, no longer interpreted as reflections of effort or ability, but as neutral remnants of earlier activity that do not define the present moment. The night supports this separation quietly. There are no demands that require a role to be performed, no situations that call for a particular version of oneself to appear. As a result, awareness becomes less centered around self-description. Thoughts arise without needing to be claimed. Impressions pass without being assigned meaning or ownership. This loosening can feel unfamiliar at first. Without roles to orient around, experience may feel open in a way that does not point anywhere, leaving attention free to remain without direction. Over time, this openness becomes easier to inhabit. There is no pressure to define oneself in relation to what is happening, and without that pressure, experience feels less constrained. The body reflects this shift subtly. Posture relaxes, movement becomes minimal. There is no sense of preparing to act or respond. Identity remains intact, but it no longer occupies the foreground. It becomes something that exists in the background, available when needed, but not required to be maintained at this hour. In this softened state, the idea of finishing things loses another layer of significance. Completion is no longer tied to self-definition. and unfinished things no longer feel like indicators of who one is or what one has accomplished. The night allows this distance to exist without explanation. It does not require identity to be reaffirmed or clarified. It simply continues, carrying awareness forward without asking it to take shape. This is often when experience feels most neutral. Not empty, not profound, just unburdened by the need to perform or maintain a particular position. As time passes, the sense of being someone doing something gives way to a quieter sense of being present while nothing is required. Awareness remains without being organized around a role. Nothing about this needs to be understood or held onto. It unfolds naturally as the night continues to withdraw the structures that usually define experience. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for identity to rest. Roles can remain unfinished, descriptions can remain incomplete, and experience continues without needing to be shaped by them. The night moves on in its usual way. Awareness remains, time passes, and nothing asks to be concluded. As the night deepens further, silence and thought often begin to exist alongside each other without conflict, neither trying to replace the other, neither demanding priority, simply sharing the same space without tension. Silence does not arrive by pushing thoughts away, and thoughts do not disturb the quiet by continuing to appear. Both remain present, without insisting on dominance. During the day, silence is often treated as something to be achieved, and thought as something to be managed. Moments without activity are filled quickly, and the absence of noise can feel incomplete. At night, this relationship shifts, and silence no longer feels like a condition that must be created, but like a background that has always been there. Thoughts that arise in this silence behave differently. They do not rush forward or organize themselves into plans. They appear briefly, loosely formed, and then recede without needing to be followed, as though they belong to the quiet rather than interrupting it. This coexistence changes how silence is felt. It no longer depends on the absence of thought. It remains intact even when the mind continues to move in small, unstructured ways. In this state, the effort to quiet the mind loses relevance. There is nothing to correct, nothing to refine, and nothing to bring under control, because silence does not require cooperation from thought in order to exist. Thoughts begin to feel less intrusive here. They do not carry the weight of urgency or direction. They arrive without expectation and leave without conclusion, blending into the surrounding quiet rather than standing apart from it. The body often mirrors this balance. Stillness settles naturally. Movement becomes minimal and unintentional. Breathing continues without being noticed. In this balance, experience feels less divided. There is no struggle between activity and rest, no sense that one must replace the other for the night to continue. Silence does not expand by removing thought. It expands by no longer reacting to it. This changes the way unfinished things are experienced. When thoughts arise about what was left open, they do so quietly, without activating effort or evaluation, passing through the same silence that holds everything else. Nothing needs to be resolved for this coexistence to remain stable. Thought can continue. Silence can remain. Neither interferes with the other. As the night goes on, this arrangement becomes easier to inhabit. There is less interest in checking whether the mind has become quiet enough, and less concern about whether silence has been maintained. The night does not require either state to dominate. It allows both to exist without instruction, without hierarchy, and without needing to be balanced deliberately. In this space, the idea of finishing feels distant. There is no end point to reach, no state to complete, and no requirement for experience to resolve itself before continuing. Silence remains open. Thought remains free. Time continues without interruption. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for this balance to hold. The night supports it naturally, allowing silence and thought to share the same moment, unforced and intact, as experience moves on in its own quiet way. As the night stretches on, time often begins to feel less like something moving toward a destination and more like something simply passing, without direction or intent, as though it has stepped out of the role it plays during the day. Hours no longer feel like containers that need to be filled or managed, and minutes stop signaling progress, becoming softer, less defined, and easier to overlook. During the day, time is constantly referenced. It structures effort, creates urgency, and divides experience into portions that feel meaningful because they are measured. At night, this measuring loses relevance, and without it, time stops shaping experience in the same way. Instead of pushing forward, time seems to widen. Moments do not line up neatly. They overlap, stretch, and blend, making it harder to tell where one ends and another begins. This change affects how experience is held. Without a clear sense of before and after, there is less reason to think in terms of progress or delay, and attention no longer feels pulled toward what comes next. Unfinished things lose another layer of significance here. When time is no longer pointing forward, there is no obvious place for completion to arrive, and no reason for effort to move toward an endpoint. The night offers no countdown. There's no moment approaching that requires preparation, no threshold that must be crossed deliberately. Time continues, but it does not announce itself. In this undirected flow, experience feels less pressured. There is no sense of falling behind or needing to catch up, because there is nowhere specific to go. The body often responds to this shift quietly. Breathing slows without intention. Movement becomes occasional and unplanned. Stillness holds without effort. Thoughts reflect this change as well. They no longer arrange themselves around sequences or timelines. They appear without reference to when something should happen or what must come next. This loosening of time's structure allows experience to remain open. There is less need to check how long something has been unfinished, and less concern about how much time remains. The idea of finishing depends on direction. When direction fades, finishing loses its context, becoming something that belongs to another rhythm, one that is no longer active. In this state, unfinished things do not feel delayed. They feel paused in a way that does not require explanation, existing outside the flow of urgency and progress. Time carries them quietly. It does not demand updates. It does not require resolution. It simply moves on. As the night deepens, this undirected passage becomes easier to inhabit. Experience no longer feels like something that needs to be managed or positioned. It simply continues, held by time, without being pushed forward. Nothing about this needs to be understood or noticed. It happens whether attention follows it or not, shaped by the same steady movement that allows nights to pass without instruction. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for time to move this way. Direction can fade, completion can wait, and experience can remain where it is, carried quietly forward as the night continues. As the night continues, effort does not vanish so much as it loosens its shape, shifting from something that pushes and directs into something that simply remains, present without needing to act. What once felt like a force moving experience forward becomes a quieter background, no longer steering, no longer insisting, yet not entirely gone. During the day, effort is defined by intention. It aims, adjusts, and responds, measuring itself by what it produces. At night, intention withdraws, and without it, effort loses the structure that once made it feel necessary. This withdrawal is gradual. There is no clear handoff where effort steps aside and presence takes over. Instead, effort slowly stops pushing, stops checking, stops shaping, leaving behind a simpler awareness that does not need direction. In this state, presence does not feel empty. It feels unoccupied, where attention is still there but no longer engaged in moving anything along. Thoughts may still appear, but they do so without momentum. They do not pull effort back into action or ask to be completed. They pass through awareness lightly, leaving no trace that needs to be followed. The body reflects this change quietly. Muscles release, posture settles into stillness. Movement happens only when necessary, without planning or intent. Effort, now without a role, does not resist this shift. There is nothing for it to push against, nothing for it to accomplish, allowing it to dissolve naturally into simple presence. This presence does not replace effort as a new state to maintain. It does not ask to be held or deepened. It simply remains when effort no longer has anything to do. In this condition, unfinished things feel distant in a new way. They are no longer connected to effort at all, existing outside the flow of action, no longer inviting completion. The night supports this dissolution by remaining steady. Nothing changes that would call effort back into shape. No demands reappear. No outcomes are required. As effort fades into presence, experience becomes simpler. Not because it has been reduced, but because nothing is being added to it. Awareness stays without needing to intervene. There is no sense of doing or not doing, only of remaining where things already are. This is not rest as an achievement. It is rest as the absence of push, where effort dissolves because it is no longer supported by conditions that require it. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for this to happen. Effort can fade without consequence. Presence can remain without purpose. And the night continues, holding experience quietly as it moves forward without asking anything to arrive or conclude. As the night moves on, the habit of keeping track of holding a quiet record of what has happened and what remains often begins to loosen, not because it is deliberately released, but because there is no longer anything that requires it. The mind stops maintaining an internal list, not out of fatigue, but out of irrelevance, as the conditions that once made tracking useful quietly disappear. During the day, Keeping track serves a purpose. It organizes effort, preserves continuity, and ensures that nothing important is lost between moments. At night, continuity no longer depends on this kind of oversight, and without a function to serve, tracking begins to fade. This fading is subtle. There is no clear moment when the last item drops away. Instead, the sense of sequence softens, and experience becomes less about remembering where things were left and more about remaining where things already are. Unfinished things are affected by this shift. Without tracking, they no longer occupy a place in a mental order. They are not ranked, not compared, and not positioned in relation to what comes next. This does not remove them from existence. It removes the frame that kept them relevant, allowing them to remain without being referenced. As tracking weakens, experience feels less layered. There is no stack of moments to manage, no sense of carrying earlier parts of the day forward. What remains is a flatter, quieter sense of now. Time continues through this flattening without interruption. It does not require continuity to be maintained consciously. It carries experience forward on its own, without needing to be monitored. Thoughts that arise here tend to be brief and self-contained. They do not depend on what came before or point toward what follows. They appear, linger momentarily, and pass without needing to be connected. The body often responds before this shift is noticed mentally. Stillness becomes more complete. Small movements slow further. There is no impulse to adjust or prepare. In the absence of tracking, the idea of finishing becomes difficult to sustain. Without a sense of sequence, there is no clear place for an endpoint to occur, and no reason for effort to return. Experience becomes simpler here, not because it is reduced, but because it is no longer being arranged. Nothing is held together deliberately. Nothing is kept in view. Everything remains where it is. The night supports this simplicity by remaining consistent. No new information arrives. No changes require response. There is nothing to keep track of. As this continues, awareness feels less burdened, not lighter in a noticeable way, but quieter, less occupied with maintaining coherence. Unfinished things remain unfinished, but without a place in an internal order. They no longer assert themselves. They exist without needing to be carried forward or accounted for. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for tracking to fade. The night allows experience to remain without record, without sequence, and without conclusion, moving forward quietly as it always has. As the night continues, experience often begins to feel less centered around a personal point of reference, as though the constant sense of ownership that usually accompanies thoughts and actions has softened without being deliberately set aside. What remains is not detachment, but a quieter form of presence, where events are noticed without being immediately connected to a sense of mine or about me. During the day, experience is frequently filtered through personal relevance. Thoughts are interpreted in terms of intention, effort, and outcome, and unfinished things are often felt as extensions of oneself, carrying meaning because they reflect what was done or left undone. At night, this filtering weakens. Without tasks to complete or roles to maintain, thoughts lose some of their personal weight, appearing more like passing movements than reflections of identity. Unfinished things are affected by this shift as well. They no longer feel like indicators of success or failure, and they no longer carry the same emotional charge. They exist as neutral traces of earlier activity, not as statements about who one is or what one has achieved. This change does not require distance or disengagement. It happens because the structures that usually bind experience to identity are no longer active, allowing awareness to rest without constant self-reference. Thoughts in this state often feel lighter. They arise without being claimed, pass without needing to be defended, and dissolve without requiring explanation. The body mirrors this quiet neutrality. Movement becomes minimal and unself-conscious. Posture settles without adjustment. Breathing continues without being noticed. In this softened sense of self, the pressure to finish things weakens further. Completion is no longer tied to personal adequacy or responsibility, and unfinished things no longer feel like loose ends that define the present moment. The night supports this impersonal quality by offering no situations that demand self-definition. There is no audience, no performance, and no requirement to position oneself in relation to what is happening. As awareness remains in this space, experience feels less divided between observer and observed. Thoughts, sensations, and silence coexist without being assigned ownership, existing simply as parts of the same quiet flow. This does not remove meaning from experience. It removes the need to attach meaning to a personal center, allowing things to be as they are without reference. Time continues through this state without interruption. Moments pass without being measured against expectation. Nothing asks to be evaluated or completed. Unfinished things remain unfinished, but they no longer stand in relation to a self that needs to account for them. They rest where they are, without judgment, without urgency, and without demand. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for experience to become quieter in this way. The night allows awareness to loosen its grip on personal reference, letting time move forward without requiring anything to be concluded or defined. As the night goes on, the impulse to make sense of what is happening often begins to soften, not because understanding has been reached, but because understanding is no longer required for experience to continue. There is less interest in explaining, less effort spent connecting events into a coherent story, and less need to decide what anything means. During the day, making sense of things serves a purpose. It helps guide decisions, shapes effort, and allows experience to be organized into something that can be acted upon. At night, this organizing function loses relevance, and without a role to play, the need to interpret gradually fades. This fading does not feel like confusion. It feels like a quiet release from the responsibility of understanding, where awareness no longer needs to keep everything in view or resolve what is happening into a clear picture. Thoughts that arise in this state are often incomplete. They do not build toward conclusions or ask to be followed through. They appear as fragments, impressions, or half-formed ideas, and then pass without needing to be clarified. The absence of interpretation changes how unfinished things are experienced. Without the drive to explain or evaluate them, they lose their complexity, becoming simpler, less demanding, and easier to leave where they are. This does not remove meaning from experience. It changes the way meaning is held, allowing it to remain open rather than finalized. The body often reflects this shift before it is noticed mentally. Movement slows further. Breathing becomes more even. There is less impulse to adjust or respond. In this state, the idea that something must be understood before it can be set aside loses its force. Experience does not wait for clarity in order to move forward, and the night does not require comprehension to continue. As the hours pass, the effort to make sense of things feels increasingly unnecessary. There is no feedback for it to work with, no new information arriving, and no reason to keep refining understanding. Unfinished questions remain unanswered without creating tension. They do not demand closure or explanation. They exist quietly, without pressing for resolution. This quiet coexistence allows experience to remain fluid. Nothing needs to be pinned down. Nothing needs to be concluded. Everything is allowed to remain slightly open. The night supports this openness by remaining unchanged. It does not introduce new details that require interpretation. It does not ask for analysis or response. As attention rests in this state, understanding becomes optional. Experience continues whether or not it is explained, and time moves forward without waiting for things to make sense. Nothing needs to be finished tonight for understanding to relax. Meaning can remain unfinished, questions can remain open, and the night carries experience forward quietly, without requiring anything to be resolved or defined.